Hi everybody, I'm Jennifer Tryon, and today I'm going to be sewing up the Winding Ways quilt pattern. And what I love about this quilt is no matter when you look at it, you always find some other sub-pattern emerge. We're going to be sewing lots of curves today, and I'm going to be using the curve set by Build-A-Block in the Winding Ways pattern. So let's open it up and take a look at these dies. So these are all the dies you get in the set. So you're getting 3 different sizes. I'm using the largest size. I tend to gravitate toward the largest sizes because I feel like I get a larger quilt faster when I use the big ones. But it's totally your choice. So these are thin metal dies, and scrapbookers and card makers will already be familiar with thin metal dies. They're used for cutting. And what I'm gonna do is cut through multiple layers of fabric in this exact shape and then sew those curves together. This saves me from ever having to rotary cut around a curve, because what's so important when you're sewing curves is getting it accurate and precise every single time. This way your pattern comes together better at the end. So you'll see the shapes that I've got here. You've got your main piece, your bottom piece, and then you've got a side piece, and you're gonna use that side piece twice. So let's get cutting. So I'm using the Gemini, and I'm using yardage from the Sarah Signature Sew Homemade collection. I love this fabric. It's very vintage with a modern twist, but definitely it makes me feel like home. Like this is the kind of pattern my grandmother might have made for me way back when. I love that it's got a modern twist now though. So I'm gonna cut the fabric using this yardage. So I've made sure it's nice and pressed, and I'm gonna go through about 8 layers at a time. So fold it up. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And we just wanna make the best use of our fabric here. You wanna make sure you're cutting it out of 2 corresponding fabrics. So in the instruction booklet, it's going to give you all kinds of different patterns and ways you can put the winding way together. I'm going to do it in the traditional winding way, which is sort of this bloom shape. And you can see it's going to give you the measurements for 6, 8, and a 12-inch block. I'm using the largest one, so we're going to get a 12-inch block out of this. But feel free to have some fun, especially once your shapes are cut. Mix and match them around and see what you can come up with. There's lots of ideas in the book, though. At the beginning of the instructions, it's also going to tell you about cutting against the grain. And this is really crucial when you're sewing curves, because you want it to have a little bit of stretch so that you can take that curve nicely when you're sewing it together. So the selvage is your grain line, or the edge of the fabric, your raw edge. Sometimes you can see it's got little holes in it. It's where the end of the bolt is. So you want to make sure the straight lines of the dies are lined up with that selvage. And that way, you know you're going to get the maximum amount of stretch out of your fabric. Okay, so I'm just going to cut this so I don't waste anything. And this doesn't have to be straight or perfect. Remember, the Gemini is going to do all of the real cutting. And I'm going to sandwich it up. So you're going to start with your clear plastic plate. Then I'm going to cut into my metal shim. And don't worry, your metal shim is going to get totally marked up here. That's totally fine. Then I'm going to add my fabric. Then I'm going to add my plastic shim and my clear top plate and run it through the Gemini. So no cranking, just put it into the machine and it's going to do all of the cutting. You don't need to worry about getting a curved ruler and rotary cutting around that. It's going to do all the heavy lifting for us. And there we see 8 perfect curves all at once. And another 8, and another 8. And such little waste. Look at this. Pretty cool, huh? And I want to do the exact same cut in a corresponding fabric because we're going to match them up. So just roughly cut the amount of fabric you need, and again, line it up on your plates. So bottom clear plate, metal shim, fabric and dyes, plastic shim, and top clear plastic plate. And get in the habit of rotating and flipping your plates. It just helps them wear a little longer. There we go, perfectly cut. Now I can probably even get another cut out of here. Yep. Make sure you use all of your fabric. Done. Just make sure you've cut out enough pieces to make the size of quilt that you want. Okay, now let's have a bit of fun in piecing this together. So we've got our big shape in the middle, our big curve, and then we want to flank it with our corresponding side pieces. And you see how even though this is so curved, we're still making a square here. I love that about quilt piecing. So when this is sewn together, it'll become a square and we'll just straight line piece those squares together. And we're going to do the exact same, but with the opposite fabrics. Cool, right? And now we need 4 for each block. So I'm just going to go ahead and lay them out. Can you start to see how this will come together? So now you can see what our basic block will look like. Kind of cool, huh? Okay, let's sew these together. All right, let's sew some curves, but we want to start in the correct order so that everything comes together seamlessly. All right, I'm going to start by folding my large middle piece in half. This way, I can sort of finger press in a center line. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with my outer piece, with both outer pieces actually. And once it's pressed, and I know there's a line here and a line here, I'm going to go right sides together. And concave and convex are actually facing opposite sides. So it seems a little odd, like these two may not fit together, but trust me, they will. Now, as you get better at sewing curves, you may not need to pin at all, but I like to pin exactly on that center fold, just so that everything stays nice and even across the entire piece. And then match up your ends and bring it over to the sewing machine. So I'm just starting with a little leader fabric in my sewing machine, and that just gets things activated and started before I bring this super fine tip over to the machine. So you're going to go slow, and you're going to use your fingers a lot to be constantly shifting those curves in place, because technically they're going the opposite way, and we want them to lay flush the whole time. So we'll put the concave piece down. We'll start with the blunt edge and the very top point, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. Take out your pin. Just keep overlapping the fabric like that, just so those curves are constantly flush. And you don't want to be stretching your fabric, but this is why cutting on the grain line is really important. And just keep pushing that one seam over top of the bottom until your points meet at the end. And now you're left with a little piece like this, and that perfect curve right along the edge there. It's kind of satisfying. We don't need to press this yet. You can if you want, but just a finger press is fine. And now let's add the second side. And if you feel confident about overlapping the fabric, you don't need to pin, you can just lay it down. Just make sure everything's lined up at the beginning. Now we've got two sides. Just give it a nice finger press. We don't need to pull the iron out quite yet. So same idea, I'm going to fold this in half. Just going to find my center. And then right sides together. So I'm going to line this up with the dog ears. So once you've got just the last piece to attach, and you've found your center mark, line up the edges and bring it over to your sewing machine. Remember, you're going to keep just sliding the top fabric over top of the bottom fabric so that those curves match up. It's a bit fiddly, you're not going to go fast, but if you take your time, you'll have a great curve. And by the end of a couple of these blocks, you will be a curves expert. And there we have, our block is coming together. You can trim off some of the dog ears, and you're just going to do this for every single block in both colorways. Just keep sewing those curves. Make sure those seams meet, even right at the end. Beautiful. After you've sewn them, if they feel a little, don't worry, the iron's gonna really help. The curve is going to naturally fall a certain way, so I wouldn't worry too much about making sure you press to the dark side or the light side. I would press to the side that the curve is naturally going to. It's going to sit so much nicer that way. And look at this nice, perfect curve we get. Okay, press them all. And now is when we're back to our easy straight sewing. Let's put together this block. So you're going to have both colorways, remember. And we want the points facing in, so we're getting this bit of a bloom happening. And you're just going to go right sides together. And straight seam, straight seam. So now we're back to just straight sewing. This is going to seem easy after the curves. And I can just chain piece these together, which means I don't need to stop and cut the fabric. Just keep on going. Open them up. Aha, it's looking good. And we're going to press them down. Now I am going to nest my seams, so I want to make sure I press one seam to the left and the next seam to the right. This way, they'll come together perfectly without a lot of bulk in the center. Okay, so nesting the seams just means right sides together and one seam going this way and one seam going that way. Bring those two heads together so that they kind of nest together. You can kind of wriggle it with your finger and just feel where it goes. And that's where I'm going to put my pin. I'm going to straight seam all along there, and we've got our block. And once we've got a few of them, we can start assembling our blocks. And you want to make sure, in order to achieve the secondary patterns, that you alternate the colorways. See how you can see these secondary patterns starting to form, the circles inside the blooms? It's a really cool pattern. Okay, so right sides together, again with the nested seams. There we go. Now I'm going to add one more block to the end of each of these and then start sewing my big strips together. Again, right sides together with a nested seam. And then I'll have a 3-block strip. Now I'm just adding my strips together. Just make sure everything is in a checkerboard, alternating the colors. Good pressing and good nesting makes a difference in the end. Now one last big long strip. Don't forget to take out your pins. And there we have our winding ways. Do you see how these secondary patterns start to come out? Everywhere you look on this quilt, there's another pattern. See if you can see all the little circles and even the big circles start to form. That's what's so cool about this quilt. You've got the blooms, you've got the circles, and then all of that together makes these other gigantic circles in the middle of the quilt. So just keep building, because I know when you cut it out perfectly from the beginning, you're going to be so happy with your outcome in the end.